Right.
Increasing efficiency is only going to slow down that one-way traffic. Now,
Yes.
what does Exxon do that actually reverses that traffic? For example, I can think of what you could do would be CO2 sequestration technology.
Yeah.
So could you say something about that in terms of?
From a one of the things that we have to keep in mind is returning shareholder value. So it's hard to jump into areas where you need a subsidy or some other form to make it economically attractive. You have to let the technology play itself out, and when it gets feasible and when it gets scalable, then you enter that market and try and become a player in that. So, for example, the reason I'm bringing that comment about is CO2 sequestration. Right now, our estimate is that the best that's going to happen, even all the way up to 2040, is government-sponsored projects in CO2 sequestration. We don't see that as being an economic solution. So in terms of reversing that trend, I have to honestly say I don't think we are working in that area. The closest we come to that is biofuels through algae. We've, again, placed a fairly big bet on algae with our cooperation with synthetic genomics. And I have a talk on algae that I can provide if necessary. But from a standpoint of that being a potential way of using CO2 in the air to generate oil, and again, the question being how efficient is it, how scalable is it, and there's a lot of technology development that needs to go into it before it'll become practical. But having evaluated all of these other options, solar, wind, other biomass sources, corn, ethanol, etc., what our analysis, our technical analysis, that algae is probably your most efficient solution, most promising solution for a scalable long-term solution. So that's about the closest we come to in terms of reversing the trend. Other than that, we're basically watching the space, as it were, and jumping in when we think something is feasible. So
you mentioned a lot about technology. So you mentioned a lot about technology in your presentation. So I would like to ask what areas of technology is ExxonMobil looking for developing by 2040 so that like 60% of the production will still be by oil and gas. So what are the technologies they're looking into?
Some key ones I would point to is directional drilling, for example, being able to get out to longer reaches so that things like shale gas can become more feasible. Battery technologies for improving. We have some research going into membrane technologies that are used in lithium hydride batteries. Algae was another one that I mentioned before. And things like deep water and Arctic technology, for example, LNG, liquefied natural gas, the tanker technology for that, the liquefaction process for that, etc. There's a lot of technical improvements that are going into each of those, essentially dropping the cost of transporting gas from source to demand areas.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask you, you're talking about subsidy. Can you give an idea as to the level of subsidy per unit of energy, oil industry versus energy industry in the US? Do you have that information?
No, I'm afraid no. But could you repeat your question one more time, just to...
I'm trying to understand what is the level of subsidy the oil industry per unit of energy is getting, which service other non-conventional energy systems in the US today.
I see. I don't have numbers, but I can talk a little bit about trends. From a oil and gas industry standpoint, the subsidies, if you want to call it that, comes more in the form of tax breaks for developing certain areas and so on. Whereas areas like ethanol has got a fairly significant subsidy in the US, for example. And there's been some recent initiatives by the U.S. government on solar energy, providing subsidies to them. Again, I don't have the numbers, but it's also hard to compare because the scale of each of these industries is so different. So you need to normalize it in some fashion per unit of energy, and I'm afraid I don't have that information on it. But as far as I know, there aren't very many subsidies. If anything, people think we make too much money, so why would you subsidize us? It's more, the subsidies are more in the new, and rightly so. I mean, a lot of these new technologies like solar and wind, etc., will come up through a government encouraging research and innovation into these areas. I mean, that's how the oil and gas industry started way back when. So that's just the natural phase that those technologies are in. So they probably get more subsidies than we do, and rightly so.
What makes these countries liable to follow certain protocols, say the international protocols that we have, and what, as ExxonMobil being a company, what power does it have to enforce these policies? For example, China being a communist country could come up with a policy which says everyone below the age of 25 should drive non-motor powered vehicles.
Right.
But that could not be the case in a demand-driven economy like US. So
yeah, or India for that matter. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Again, as a private company, we have very little influence in terms of enforcing any of these mandates. We do have influence, or at least we do get consulted in terms of developing those mandates. We work closely with a lot of governments around the world to try, for example, CO2 tax versus cap and trade, two different ways of regulating carbon emissions. We have a position on that. Our position is a CO2 tax is a much more equitable way of leveling the playing field for all of these. So we talk to the government about that. We kind of give them our point of view and try to influence mandates in the direction that we think is the right way to go about it. But that's about the limit of our influence. And then after that, whatever law gets passed, we have no choice but to follow that law. But in the process of getting to that point, we do have some conversation with a lot of the governments around the world.
So there's no universal standard that you can have. It has to be in a local country level, strategies that these companies have to adopt. Right?
That's how it is now. Like we were talking about the global agreements. If there are global agreements that get in place, and we monitor it, we do provide some discussions into meetings like the Kyoto meeting, etc. But at the end of the day, we will have to comply with whatever global mandates come out. It's just that there isn't one today. It's mostly local right now. True, yeah. But that's more at the utility industry level. And so, yeah, even in Texas, for example, there is a mandate that California especially has a mandate that says a certain percentage of your energy generated has got to come from renewable sources, etc. And the utility companies do comply with that. But we are not in that business, so it doesn't impact. What might impact us is more the fuel efficiency guidelines and so on, coming up with the right kind of fuels for that, coming up with the right kinds of technologies to meet those guidelines, etc. So that's where we get influenced by mandates. I got to hand out my ExxonMobil caps, and I get to judge this. But the first one I want to give up is to the gentleman here for all of your excellent questions. Thank you. Yeah, and you, sir, because I wasn't able to answer the questions that you raised, so one for you for hosting me. Thank you.